And welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Battery Insiders podcast today, live from London. It's a really exciting time because in the world of batteries, there's a lot of momentum and a lot of topics are getting updated, and you might have read about it. And there's a fantastic book called Volt Rush, which I personally very much enjoyed. And I'm extremely delighted to have actually the author with me today, Henry Sanderson, who actually wrote that book. So we're going to talk about this book. He's also, I think, a really fascinating person. He has been in lots of different positions. He's also the executive editor of Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, but also previously has been a commodities correspondent at the Financial Times, as well as before that even with Bloomberg in Beijing, and actually just came back from a conference with the Financial Times on the future of automotive. So I think there's a lot of momentum, and I can appreciate the work you've been doing there as well. But now, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
Brilliant. So maybe we can dive in right away. Talk about this book, Volt Rush. Again, I personally have told you I gifted it to many people, many Battery MBA lecturers or recipients and other friends of mine.
Thank you. I owe you a beer.
I will take you up on that on one day. And maybe if you could just maybe share a bit about what has been your thought behind it, and also a bit of an overview for anybody who hasn't read it yet.
Yeah, so the book really came out of my experience writing about commodities, writing about mining, in combination with my interest in China and also in clean energy. And the book really tries to give readers a sense of how many of raw materials, the process of extracting, processing, mining raw materials, but also how we'll rely on raw materials for the clean energy transition. Because I think many people used to think, moving from fossil fuels to clean energy would somehow, not involve industrial processes or minerals, raw materials, mining. But I think the book tries to show that we'll need many more of these mined minerals to make all the clean energy technologies we require. And in addition, the geopolitics of the energy transition is being quite driven by these raw materials supply chains. So the whole supply chain from mine to battery. So the book really tries to combine these two things, which is let's open everyone's eyes to realize what this energy transition actually means in terms of building these new technologies, and secondly, the geopolitics of it and how China has taken a really, very dominant role in these clean energy supply chains, all the way from mine to battery. So that's what I was trying to get across. But the book tries to be optimistic and hopeful. I don't think I could have written a book that says, everything's bad because we are relying on mined raw materials and there's problems in these supply chains. I try to be hopeful and optimistic because that's the way I want to think about it, and that's the way I want the world to move. Where we can improve these processes. In many cases, we can improve much easier than with fossil fuels, such as recycling, which I'm sure we can talk about. So I try to say, open our eyes, and once we realize what it requires, we can improve these supply chains. And the geopolitics feeds in because once we localize and reshore, often we can improve these processes as well. So that's what I try to achieve.
No, and I think, as someone, has been in the battery space and, dealing with a couple of these topics, but I think you went really in depth and followed also the stories of these individual minerals. And I found this really fascinating. I remember, you mentioned to you one thing I really found so fascinating was lithium, right? And the lithium kind of roasting. I think you found great terms. I guess that's a, way to do. And I kind of taking the hard rock from Australia and then bringing from China to this really energy intense process from a roasting and refining, etc. So maybe if you could share a bit more on that.
Yeah, so I think what the book tried to show is that all these supply chains are pretty energy intense, and China has dominated them in many cases because these were considered low value or energy intense polluting supply chains that we were happy to offshore. And I think now the West is trying to reshore them. It's realizing how difficult it is to do these things, right? And how energy intense it is, and you need lots of sulfuric acid and all these other things. And China's really mastered the art of a lot of these processing steps in the supply chain. So if you take something like lithium, it's dug up from big open pit mines in Australia. and then, as you say, put on a boat to China, and then trucked to a processing plant where it's roasted to, as you said, high temperatures, and uses sulfuric acid, etc. So all of this increases the carbon footprint of the battery and eventually the electric vehicles. So on the one hand, China has got the costs down and managed to really master these supply chains. But on the other hand, there's a lot of, hidden emissions in these supply chains that ends up adding to the carbon burden of the electric vehicle. And what we need to do is, as EVs get scaled up, we've got to ensure that the supply chain is cleaned up and the emissions are reduced, because we don't want to emit unnecessary CO2, right, in this process. So I think that's really part of it. But China accounted for over 65% of processed lithium. So it's really like an iron ore and steel. It's this Australia-China relationship, right? So Australia produces, the spodumene, the lithium that's dug up, and China processes the lithium. The people are trying to take a hard look at that supply chain now and find ways to improve it.
Fascinating. I think another kind of material, when we're talking about graphite, I think it's quite a hot topic right now, and all of OEMs having these challenges. Trying to figure out, how they can diversify the supply chains with the US, IRA, right? Yeah. Trying to kind of also find ways out of China, realizing it's very difficult. Right now, maybe you could expand a bit more on graphite. Yeah,
so graphite's another mineral where China has, almost absolute dominance. And again, this is way more than what we've seen in fossil fuels in terms of one country having, control of the supply chain. And with China and graphite, it not only, graphite can be man-made synthetic graphite or natural graphite, which is dug up and mined. China is equally dominant in both. So the synthetic graphite, is can come from coal tar pitch or from pet coke, petroleum coke. So it begins, from that area, and then it gets sort of heated up again to thousands of degrees in these furnaces in China. And all this process is very carbon intense and has a big footprint on the eventual batteries. So obviously, as we try to improve these supply chains, can you do synthetic graphite in a better way using renewable energy, using other processes, and natural graphite as well? Can we it can be mined elsewhere, so can we then process it elsewhere as well? But graphite is a huge problem for Western automakers, for the whole EV industry. If you're thinking geopolitically, right? If you're not, fine. But if you're thinking geopolitically, how do you even make a dent in that market share that China has? And also, because they're ahead, they've got the scale, which gives them the cost advantage. So how do you compete? And so the subsidies like the Inflation Reduction Act are one way to compete with China. But the US has just the other day sort of extended the timeline for graphite, so giving automakers slightly longer time where they can use Chinese graphite. So that just highlights the difficulty of shifting these supply chains. So it's a real fundamental question for the West, which is, what's required to do it, to recreate or to reduce reliance on China? What's required in terms of subsidies or policy? And then where are you going to focus your attention? And also, what is a comfortable level of de-risking or reducing reliance on China? So these are all sort of fundamental questions, because we are now in a period where we need to decarbonize even more rapidly, right? You've seen the reports about the temperatures, but yet, we have these geopolitical concerns. So how do we balance the two? That's a really fundamental issue.
Totally, and I mean, pun intended, but I feel it really has been a gold rush, in getting lots of the synthetic graphite companies and startups going in Europe as well. I think, and all over from New Zealand to Europe. In Scandinavia, I've seen a few of them pop up since also your book came out. So I think, companies and startups are trying, but I think getting the capacities, as you said, just making a dent seems really challenging. But I think, again, we also have seen your regulation catching up since then as well, right? From your Critical Minerals Act, having requirements on diversifying supply chains, don't have too much from one region.
Precisely. Yeah, so Europe set these quite ambitious targets where, by 2030, they're saying at least 10% of the annual consumption should come from locally extracted minerals, but 40% processed within the EU. So that's a very high target, given that it's very basically nothing now. And 25% from recycled materials, also very ambitious. And then it says, well, no single third country should supply more than 65%. So, obviously aimed at China. So, the policy's there, but the question is, what are you going to do to support this policy, these targets? And I think in the US and Europe, we have seen a lot of money go to battery factories, to other parts of the supply chain, but it's the mining and the sort of raw material mining and processing that's so challenging. Permitting, getting approval for these projects. For instance, there's a graphite mine in Sweden, and it's still waiting on a Supreme Court decision on an appeal to the mine. So it all takes a lot of time in Europe to kind of get it going. So that's the real challenge, and we don't have time, right? Time is the one thing that we don't necessarily have.
Totally. I was just recently in Brussels, and definitely I've seen the sentiment, right? Like that we need faster permitting. So I think people are aware, and also I think, on the regulatory side, I think there is momentum in this, but momentum has to be fast.
Yeah, I think it's hard because, as I say, China has a very good industrial ecosystem, and they have these industrial parks where, you can get supplies of the acids and reagents and the infrastructure and the energy. I think a Chinese official called them this week they're like a well-stocked gym. You've got everything you need, and I think the problem with Europe and the US is we've lost so many of these other industries. So what do you do with the waste product? Who's going to take that? Where do you get the other supplies from? So you don't have that advantage that China has, where the local government will say, oh, here's the industrial park, we'll give you tax breaks. We'll, so much of activity in China is on the local level as well, where they give companies advantages in these industrial parks. So it's incredibly hard to replicate that sort of industrial ecosystem.
Which I actually found fascinating. I actually did another podcast a while ago where we actually spoke about these industrial parks for someone who's been in China, setting up industrial parks, etc. But we actually shared, for example, in Germany, there were a lot of these industrial parks before. It's in other industries, right? And they kind of, as you said, they got a bit forgotten. Yeah. It was more attractive to offshore it, right? And as you said, it's also kind of interesting how maybe there's sometimes full circle moments, it feels like. And then, again, in China, it's also, fantastic how things have been optimized, right? Some processes, etc. And really kind of, again, and now kind of exporting it in other regions again, and really ramping up these industries. So it's kind of fascinating to also see how things are, I think then also when you look a bit in history, right? Yes. How things tend to kind of not static, they're going back and forth in a way. Yeah,
and I think we're seeing this, such a deep fundamental rethink in the West now about, market economies and what's the role of the government. We had so many decades of, I guess, neoliberal thinking, and, the government was the problem, not the solution. But the problem was it all worked well while China was lower down the value chain and was doing all these things that were not particularly high value. But now it's like, well, wait a second, they have the whole clean energy supply chain, but they're also producing electric vehicles, high value electric vehicles with AI software, self-driving, etc., and exporting those vehicles. So they moved up the value chain. So they're massively threatening, Germany and other countries. So this is the real issue, and they've used the advantages they've gained, for many years, making things lower down the value chain to improve the cost of the higher value things. So now it's a very difficult situation to compete with that. And I think it is sad in many respects, because I think like Germany in the early 2000s was really driven by a desire to switch to renewable energy and also have industries that could export solar panels and other clean energy technologies, and has really lost a lot of that business to China.
Yeah. So now we spoke a bit about lithium, right? We spoke a bit about graphite, two very important components, which also in the world of we're going more LFP, and can talk about this implication as well in China. I think the other two technologies which could be somewhat competition would be sodium ion, right, for lithium. Yeah. And we can talk about lithium metal maybe for graphite and silicon, which can reduce some of the graphite dependence. So there are, of course, approaches which could also maybe impact again some of the needs for that. Yeah. So we can talk about that, but also I want to make sure we talk about cobalt, maybe a bit of nickel, which of course is also more on the NMC side, right, and NCA side, which is still the high energy dense form. Again, LFP is a big challenger, I would say, and we've seen the how we see the numbers getting pushed and the boundaries being pushed with LFP as well now. But maybe also could share some of the insights on cobalt and then maybe on nickel.
Yeah, so I think you're right. We've seen an extraordinary rise of LFP. I think, quite a few years ago, people kept saying it was just for low range vehicles in China. But actually, what we have actually seen is, massive improvements by BYD and CATL, improving the, pack level energy density, many other engineering improvements. So really improving the energy density of LFP to the point where now Western markets are adopting it, Tesla, others. So it's really become, one of the key battery chemistries. And obviously without nickel and cobalt, you have a cost advantage, and then you don't need these other supply chains. So I think it's got the huge question is how much the West will adopt LFP and how much the NCM. And then you've also got chemistries like LMFP, so adding manganese to improve the energy density. How's that going to be produced? Do you need new manufacturing lines? How is that going to work out? So I think it's all to play for. And obviously, if you talk about decarbonizing transport, there's lots of different. Just look out the window here, right? You see trucks. You see, there's lots of different vehicles, all of which will need different types of batteries. And the US market as well. Markets we're concerned about range will need high range batteries. So I think when it comes to nickel and cobalt, we still definitely see a future, right? Because we need different types of batteries for different uses. And cobalt is really, the Democratic Republic of Congo is the Saudi Arabia of cobalt. And what's so interesting is in my book I talk about this deal where China Moly, which is a Chinese mining company, which was partially owned by a local state-owned company, acquired a few years ago the Tenke Fungurume mine in the DRC, which is one of the best copper and cobalt mines in the world, from an American company, Freeport McMoran. And now China Moly has overtaken Glencore to be the biggest cobalt producer in the world. And it's obviously copper is also critical to the energy transition. So I just think that's a fascinating example of how Chinese companies make acquisitions often in a downturn. Sort of back then was when copper prices had fallen, and that's when they bought this asset. So anyway, cobalt, the cobalt and copper are both really needed for the energy transition. So that's an example of China's sort of foresight there. And nickel as well. Chinese companies have invested billions in Indonesia to build out nickel processing, converting the country's rich nickel mines into material for batteries. So again, they've been quite far ahead in Indonesia as well. But all of these, but nickel and cobalt, they talk about in the book, which is some of the issues that come with extracting these minerals. So in cobalt, you have child mining, local people digging for cobalt by hand, and then nickel, you have the industrial parks they've built in Indonesia. Yes, they put a lot of money in, and we wouldn't have EVs without nickel from Indonesia, but they have impacts on the environment. Indonesia is obviously coal-based economy, so now, as I said at the beginning, we're trying to improve these supply chains. So these are all questions, and it's a question of we need the nickel now, we need the cobalt now. Yes, that's right. To make EVs, it's better to make EVs than not to. But also, how can we improve these supply chains? And I think it's very easy to say one thing about sustainability and etc. and how great you are, but we still need money actually invested in the ground and people to actually build these plants and actually get nickel and cobalt produced. So credit to Chinese for doing that, and I think we need to see Western companies really build and engage and move forward with these plants.
I think one kind of theme there is vertical integration, right? And I think it's been interesting to see in automotive, and again, I learned from my automotive friends, essentially there was more vertical integration in the past, and it kind of became very supplier based, and Tesla kind of in the US showed there's an approach again for vertical integration. And then we have companies now in the battery space like CATL, but then also BYD even going from vertical integration from cells then to vehicles. So maybe kind of some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, BYD's shown this vertical integration strategy, right? They produce, they're the only automaker, I think, that, produces their own batteries. You look at the top 2 battery producers in the world, it's CATL and BYD. So it's extraordinary. They produce their own batteries, semiconductors, many other parts. But I would say, they've invested in some raw materials, but I would say it seems that the automakers often they stop at the raw materials, and we haven't seen Tesla invest in mines, apart from offtakes. But we haven't seen automakers necessarily go to the mining sector, with a few exceptions, such as General Motors investing in a lithium mine in the US. But yeah, so I think there is vertical integration, but again, we need investment in the raw material supply so that the whole supply chain works. And I think yes, China does have an advantage. Obviously, if you have these big companies like CATL, they also are vertically integrated to lithium mines, etc. So that helps the whole Chinese industry.
Yeah, and I think, the vertical integration is fascinating, right? And I think on the other hand, now we have seen automotives trying to more vertically integrate. Some of them you already mentioned. Been fortunate to be involved in some of them as well. And I think, it's fascinating to see, PowerCo more on the cell side, right, from a Volkswagen group perspective. Then maybe ACC, right, more from a Stellantis, etc. So there is approaches, but also it's not easy, right? And
not easy, and it wouldn't, doesn't. Maybe we can go too far, and everyone thinks they should try and do everything. Obviously, it's very hard to produce batteries as well as EVs, right? So, especially if you're starting out, can you actually do everything? Maybe it's not so advantageous, and maybe we should let those people who are good at mining or processing do that. But I do think the advantage is that the commodity cycles are so volatile. We've seen lithium prices hugely volatile, other commodity prices. So I think if you are vertically integrated, you can better protect yourself from this volatility, right? So if you are a battery producer like CATL, you have a lithium asset. Yes, it might be uneconomic now, but you can afford to keep it going, and then it supplies you when it's good when prices are high, etc. So if you're just a company with one asset or just focused on one thing, you're incredibly vulnerable to volatility in prices, right? And you end up having to shut down the asset. And this is one of the key challenges at the moment, which is dealing with this volatility in commodity prices, right? With low prices at the moment, with overcapacity in China, how do you make the investments now that we need? And as I said earlier, Chinese companies have been good at investing, when at the bottom of a cycle and when prices are low, whereas Western companies haven't been. Everyone gets much more cautious, and money gets much more tight, and investors get much more cautious as well.
Maybe 2 final questions, right? One would be globalization, right? Like, is this kind of, in the battery world at least, are we moving towards more globalization or less? Connection you already mentioned before, there's kind of been some trends. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a good question. There's lots of talk of globalization being dead. I don't think so. I think there's still massive advantages to have a globalized supply chain. That's the way you get costs down. That's the way you encourage specialization and benefit from all the different talent around the world. So what I see happening is, yes, you have this political drive to localize and again, I guess rewrite what's happened with globalization, but I just don't see that it will be able to harness all the sort of productive powers necessary to lower the cost and enable the energy transition. So I think more likely in my mind is that there will be some areas that will have to be prioritized, such as rare earths, because of military uses or other things where you have to support industries with government largesse. But I do think for the rest of the industry, I think eventually we are going to come up with a model where we can benefit from globalization while somehow reducing some of the geopolitical concerns, whether that's joint ventures or structures like that. But there's got to be some way of doing it where we don't give up all the gains we've made right in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Maybe like a final question, right, more on prices. Because some lithium price went down a lot, right? So I think this has been a relief also, I think, for some in the industry. Of course, there's always question, what will be the future? I mean, also I think it impacted like technologies such as sodium ion, right? Yeah. Where I spoke to automotive, so told me essentially, to be honest, the price for us to make it, useful for us, the price of lithium has to reach that number, 40,000 or something. So we don't really see this right now, so we're relaxed. So we focus on lithium now. Yeah. Any thoughts on this? What to do in this really volatile world?
Yeah, so that's right. As I said, lithium volatility has been, relief to some, problem to others, but generally just dealing with the volatility in prices, I think, is an issue. And I think with sodium ion, people say you'd need at least 150,000 renminbi a ton lithium to make it economic. And what I've heard is sodium ion, costs can be, double lithium ion. So obviously at this moment, you could say the economic case is under question. But again, we don't know what lithium is going to be in a month, 2 months, a year, 2 years. No one can forecast what prices are going to do. And I think, in commodities, you do see these cycles where, as I said, now prices are low, so investments getting curtailed or withdrawn. So therefore, that sets up for the next price rally, and on you go, right? So I think, pretty sure from China's point of view or for others, why not have sodium ion as you want a suite of technologies to make sure the energy transition is robust, right? And you don't have vulnerabilities, right? And it comes back to energy security, right? Look at Europe and Russian gas, and look at COVID and supply chains. Like, how do you reduce these vulnerabilities? And I think China it definitely thinks of electric vehicles, clean energy as energy security, right? Reducing oil imports, supporting the industrial renaissance and advanced manufacturing, but they want to reduce vulnerabilities and choke points as well, right? So how can you diversify the technologies, the supply chains? How can you mine more raw materials within China? Even if it's not economic, maybe that's something you'd want. Again, when prices go high. So I think that's why I think other technologies are needed, and especially for energy storage, right, where you don't have the requirements of electric vehicles. But the big question is lithium ion. We've had remarkable cost reductions because of the scale, right? And the question is what else can get scaled up to reduce the costs. I think this is the tricky question, because cost is so important.
Absolutely. Henry, I could speak with you much, much longer. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for this today. I know we have to go. But yeah, just really want to thank you for coming on the podcast, Fascinating Insights. Again, I can highly recommend the book, Gold Rush. If you haven't read it yet, you probably want to read it. I, again, very much enjoyed it, and I know many of my friends did as well. Again, I want to thank you all for listening. My name is Simon Ingeke, founder and chair of Battery Associates. And if you're interested, please follow us on YouTube and see more of these Battery Insiders episodes, but also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else where you listen to these podcasts. And again, thanks again, Henry, for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.